to the second episode of my Firearms series. Now before I get into it, I'm going to have to explain a few things because it's a huge technological jump from my last video. We're jumping from single shot, flintlock, smoothbore, ball and powder weapons to a bolt action, magazine fed, centerfire rifle. Now there's a lot of different factors that occurred to this jump. I'm going to try to list them chronologically, but it's a bit difficult because certain things were happening simultaneously. Now the first significant invention was that of the percussion cap. Its life started in 1800 when the British chemical engineer Charles Howard discovered fulminates. Fulminates are ions that have a single weak nitrogen-oxygen bond that is sensitive to friction. And it wasn't too long after this that someone decided that it could be used as an ignition system for a firearm. The first person to try that out was a British reverend named Alexander John Forsyth. And he developed this because he noticed when he was hunting birds, the birds would be frightened by the initial flash. And that flash is what you've seen in my last video when you pull the trigger on this. So he decided he would develop a sparkless ignition. Now this was a brilliant idea at the time, and he tried to patent it and sell it to the British for use in the Napoleonic Wars, but it did have some kind of disastrous effects, and it was rejected by the Royal Armoury. But finally in 1814, an American by the name of Joshua Shaw developed the percussion cap. It's argued who actually developed it, but he kind of gets the credit, and I'll let you do the arguing about that. The significant point is that in the early 1800s, the percussion cap was developed. The percussion cap is a small metal cap with a fulminate in it. Now the change between the percussion cap and the flintlock may not seem that significant, but it was a huge revolution in gun design because this is a pretty much open design. I mean, you could close it down, but it's still possible for it to get wet. And if this gets wet, it's not going to fire. But the percussion cap eliminated that. Didn't matter if it was wet. You simply put the cap on the end here on a nipple that had a channel that led directly into the charge or the barrel. So whether rain or shine, you put this cap on there, cock the hammer back. When you pull the trigger, the hammer would strike the cap, igniting the fulminate and igniting the charge. This changed warfare. It made loading quicker and it made guns more reliable. It was a great invention. The next thing I'm going to explain is rifling. Now rifling is something that people might mistake to think as a relatively modern invention, but it's not. It was actually developed at the end of the 15th century in Germany. But the problem with rifling was, in order for rifling to be effective, the bullet has to engage the rifling, meaning it has to be big enough that it's touching all sides of the barrel as it's being fired. And the problem with that is, if you remember in my last video, I explained how this is a 62 caliber pistol, but the projectile is 60 cal. It could roll right down the barrel and right out. That makes it easier to load. The rifle, it had to be a tight fit, which means it takes longer to reload. It takes a lot more force, and after you fire it, it's soft lead, bits of it scrape off in the barrel and it gets harder to load after each shot. But there was a brilliant design in 1849 by Claude Etienne Minier that was appropriately called the Minier ball. Now the Minier ball wasn't your standard ball, it was actually a conical bullet, but it had a hollow cavity in the back so that when it was fired, it expanded and engaged the rifling. So this meant you had the advantage of rifling, but you no longer had the disadvantage of the slow loading with tighter rounds. When Minier balls caught on, they started using rifling widespread in militaries. And the Minier ball is the reason that in wars like the Crimean War and the American Civil War, there was a much higher casualty rate than wars before, because you're using the same tactics that they developed for muskets with vastly more accurate rifles. And that actually brought about the decline of traditional line warfare. Now, just before the Minier ball was invented, you had the start of metal cartridges. Now, metal cartridges were an advancement based on the percussion cap I discussed earlier. The first metal cartridge was produced in 1845. It was the 22 BB cap cartridge. That was a rim-fire cartridge. And what that is it's basically a percussion cap that's flattened out, and the fulminating explosive is in the rim of the cartridge. So when you pull the trigger, a hammer just dents the rim of the cartridge, causing it to ignite the powder, if there's a powder in it. The 22 BB cap didn't actually have the gunpowder charge, it just used the primer as its charge. It wasn't meant as a weapon, it was just an indoor shooting gallery kind of toy. It wasn't long after the rimfire cartridges that centerfire cartridges were first invented. The first centerfire cartridge was invented in 1852 by Charles Lancaster, though I'm unaware of its caliber. Now, a centerfire cartridge is one that has a primer placed at the center of the back of the round, and this would be hit by a firing pin. Here you can see the difference between a spent centerfire shell casing on top and a spent rimfire shell casing on the bottom. The advantage of a centerfire cartridge is that its shell casing can be reused. All you have to do is replace the primer, replace the powder, and replace the bullet. Now, the next major development was that of smokeless powder. And the advent of smokeless powder started with new chemicals developed. The first of which was nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin was the first chemical explosive that was more powerful than black powder, but it was too unstable to be used in firearms. Just shaking it too violently could cause it to go off. In the same year, nitrocellulose was invented, also called gun cotton. Now, this was a lot more stable to use, but it was very dangerous to develop, so it also didn't have widespread use. Eventually, much more stable gunpowder substitutes were developed, such as cordite. Now, a lack of smoke wasn't the only advantage of smokeless powder. Another advantage is that smokeless powder yielded a much higher energy output. This meant the bullet was less affected by wind and affected much later by gravity. So the bullet would fire straighter, longer, and faster. And now we get into the rifle I'm going to show you now. Now, there's one more thing I'm going to explain briefly. I'm not going to get into too much detail about actions in this video, but just for this gun I will explain that it is a bolt action rifle. And bolt action rifles were developed actually in the early 1820s, but they were a bit precarious and impractical at the time. It wasn't until the metal cartridge was invented that these rifles really shone. Now, this weapon begins when the Scot James Paris Lee developed his famous rear locking bolts. A man named William Ellis Metford developed a hexagonal rifling system, and the combination of Lee's rear locking bolt and Metford's hexagonal rifling made the Lee-Metford rifle in 1888. But in 1889, the smokeless propellant cordite I mentioned earlier was invented, and they wanted to adapt it to the .303 British round that the Lee-Metford rifle fired, and they did adapt it to it. It worked, but the pressure was too high, the bullet velocity was too fast that it would wore the barrels out, and the barrels would be shot after only about 6,000 rounds. So something had to be done. The rifle was then changed to use the new 5-groove rifling system developed at the Royal Small Arms Factory, Enfield, and thus in 1895 the magazine Lee-Enfield rifle was born. The SMLE rifle, or SMLE, was used officially by the British up until 1926. It was slowly phased out and replaced by the short magazine Lee-Enfield rifle, the SMLE or SMLE of 1904, more specifically the No. 1 Mark III SMLE rifle of 1907. These SMLE rifles were lighter and had a barrel that was 5 inches shorter than the SMLE. This is the S.M.L.E. No. 4 Mark II rifle, developed in 1949. The SMLE and its variants were used from 1895 till 1957 as the official British rifle. This rifle has a rear ring sight, which is used from 0 to 200 yards, and a flip-up peep sight, which is adjustable up to 1,300 yards. This is Lee's famous rear locking bolt. You don't have to move far from the trigger to get to the bolt. Also, it only has to be raised 60 degrees to operate. And it cocks on closing, not opening. Now the way this rifle works is very simple. When you pull the trigger, it lowers the sear right here. And when you engage the safety, it puts this lock in place. Those two implementations I just showed you correspond with the cocking piece on the bolt. When you cock the bolt, this forward notch gets locked on the sear. And if you engage the safety, it catches on this rear notch, which means if you pull the trigger, the weapon won't fire. Another way I can demonstrate this to you is to show that if you pull the trigger, you can close the bolt without cocking the weapon. Now the SMLE is a great weapon. I just love the weight, the feel of it. It's a great design, lasts for years. This particular weapon I'm holding is over 60 years old, but it still functions just perfectly fine today. I feel like I might have talked about this weapon enough already, so now I'm going to go ahead and show you this weapon in action. Check it out.